Hello, and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. First off, to the west of Bakhmut, the Russians have made a small advance here to the south of Khomove in the direction of Ivanivske. We see that the Russians are starting operations here to the south rather than straight to the west. This is likely because the Russians are planning on taking Ivanivske before moving to the canal. The reason for that is that Ivanivske itself is centrally positioned among the west of Bakhmut. Capturing Ivanivske would allow the Russians to capture this whole section of the front line between Bakhmut and the canal. This would allow the Russians to just completely cut off the southern portion of the front line where they can capture Avdiivka and Avdiivka without any issues and hold the front line between Bakhmut, the canal line, and the south completely. This would also allow the Russians to then start a landing operation across the canal line where they will start attacking Jazov Yar as the main target in this section of the front. So as we have seen previously, when the Wagner forces were fighting in this section of the front line, the Russians will likely go after Stupushki and Perechine before they start going for Jazov Yar in the north. So you'll likely see that the Russians in this section of the front line will focus on Ivanivske first and foremost. Then there's also the fighting in the north, which is centered around Avdiivka. If the Russians capture Avdiivka and then move on to Kalininya, then they will have this northern section as well, moving on to Rivorivka, and then just move along the canal line here to the north and go beyond and flank the Ukrainian positions to the north, including Siversk. Instead of going and storming Siversk head on, they can go around it by capturing the canal, and that would leave the back of Siversk to Russian positions by the canal and the river line to the north. If the Russians also manage to advance in the Kreminna section towards Liman, as we've seen multiple pieces of footage and updates as well as geolocated footage just like this one, which shows Russian positions here to the east of Terny and Yampolivka. Combined this with the fighting by Torske that we saw last year, as well as Sarishne, the Russians could launch an operation here by the Serebets River towards Liman. And if the Russians manage to capture Liman and the canal line, then Siversk could be completely isolated by Russian positions to the north, to the west, to the east, and to the south. All of this would allow the Russians to take complete control over the area, especially if the Ukrainian forces withdraw beyond the canal line prior to an encirclement. But seeing how the Ukrainians, instead of retrieving their soldiers out of Avdiivka, they're instead sending reinforcements. And in regards to this, we have an update here by Selydove, which is to the west of Avdiivka. Selydove is an area that has training facilities, and it is located about 30 kilometers from the front line. According to Russian sources on Telegram, it is reported that the Ukrainians had gathered up to 1,500 soldiers, or half a brigade, to train and redeploy here at Selydove in anticipation of fighting towards the Avdiivka direction. So these soldiers were redeploying from the west or from the north towards Avdiivka. However, the Russians spotted this concentration of soldiers, as there was a significant concentration of soldiers that we have not seen so close to the front line since the start of the war. The Russians then decided to take advantage of it, as they will, of course, do whenever they see concentration of forces. The Ukrainians have done the same, but this is a significant amount. So the Russians then started launching cluster munitions on Selydove, completely demolishing it for 2 hours. They also launched missile strikes on the village. So with this many strikes in such a small area, it is clear that if there was this concentration of 1,500 soldiers, and this information is accurate, then the Ukrainians would have taken significant casualties on reinforcements being redeployed to Avdiivka. And this is actually very important that these reinforcements arrive, because the 110th Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces has withdrawn from the city. So everyone who was calling Syriac Maps a liar for saying that there are signs of a withdrawal, we now see that it did happen. The 110th Mechanized Brigade, which has been fighting in Avdiivka for 2 years since the very start of the war, has finally been withdrawn after taking too many losses. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians' 110th Mechanized Brigade has been withdrawn. Therefore, new units need to be sent in to cover their exit. And for this coverage, the Ukrainian new Commander-in-Chief Syrsky is just sending a lot of units there. It is reported about 4 brigades are being rotated to Avdiivka. Some have already arrived, while some are on the way, and the ones by Selydove must have been on the way. Therefore, we see that the Ukrainians are trying to send a lot of reinforcements and a lot of elite units to Avdiivka to cover for the units that are leaving, as well as to prevent further Russian advances, because Syrsky promised Zelensky to hold the city. So we're seeing that there is a significant change due to Syrsky being in command, and this is something that we wouldn't have seen under Zaluzhny. This is why it's only taking place now, after the firing of Zaluzhny. At the same time, we're also seeing that the Russians are starting to commit their main forces in the north of Avdiivka, as there is reported that additional assault groups and armored vehicles, as well as tanks, including T-90Ms, are being sent into the city to support the advances of the Russians and to consolidate their gains. So we're seeing that there is going to be a major battle taking place in Avdiivka and on the flanks, as the Ukrainians are building up a significant force to deal with the Russians, and the Russians are now committing their main force in this section of the front line. So far, it is reported that the Ukrainian units being sent to Avdiivka are not being sent to launch any counterattack, but are instead being sent to hold the lines within Avdiivka and the flanks. What I expected the Ukrainians to do was to concentrate a large amount of forces in the north and then move towards Krasnohorivka and Kamyanka, Novoselivka, Druha here to the east, and pretty much capture the surrounding villages to the north, capture the flank of the Russians, and take advantage of a weakened position here to the north. Because comparing the northern flank with the southern flank, there's a river line here, and there's not really that many units to be cut off. But in the north, there's a much bigger gain to be gained. The Ukrainians could completely cut off all of the Russians in the north of the city and undo months of Russian advances, yet they are instead sending their reinforcements to hold the line within the city and on the flanks instead of preparing for a counterattack. If the Ukrainians want to break the siege and want to recapture the positions in Avdiivka and the surrounding areas they've lost, they need to counterattack the flanks. The weakest flank for the Russians is the southern flank. However, it is also the worst target to have, because taking control of the southern flank will not break the siege of Avdiivka. The northern flank is the decisive one. So if the Ukrainians want to break this siege, they need to launch a massive assault to the north. So far, the amount of brigades which have been sent to Avdiivka number 4, and all of them are being sent to the flanks as well as within the city, likely to cover for the 110th Mechanized Brigade, but also the rest of the units in the area. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians are so far playing on the defensive. They're just trying to hold the areas they have. This means that either the Ukrainians will plan to send more troops, additional troops, which would be at least another 4 brigades if they want to launch a large enough assault, but likely 5, 6 or more. That is the amount of forces they need to break these Russian positions to the north, because the Russians have their own divisions and brigades here in the area. The Russians are massively operating right now on army, armored corps, and so on, massive units that are numbering in the tens of thousands, while the Ukrainians are still operating in brigade levels. This means that the Russian defense is also very organized and cooperative between each other, despite them being massive units, while the Ukrainians would have to coordinate between the different units in the different areas. Whichever is better, we will see if that fight takes place. But likely the Russians will look to secure their flanks, send reinforcements to the flanks in anticipation of a Ukrainian counterattack. Therefore, it is likely that we'll see continuous fighting in Avdiivka, and the fighting here will be extremely intense, and a massive battle will take place in the future around Avdiivka, because Syrsky will not give up on the city, despite how little area there is left, and despite the Russians having a massive foothold in the north and the south of the city. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.